last date. But you and me are thrifty, so go all you can eat. Fill up your bag and I fill up the plate. We talk for hours and hours about the sweet and the sour and how your family's doing okay. And leaving, getting a taxi, kissing the backseat, tell the driver make the radio play. And I'm singing like, girl, you know I want your love. Your love was handmade for somebody like me. Come on now, follow my lead. I may be crazy, don't mind me. Say, boy, let's not talk too much. Grab on my waist and put that body on me. Come on now, follow my lead. Come on now, follow my lead. I'm in love with the shape of you. We push and pull like a magnet do. Although my heart is falling too. I'm in love with your body. Last night you were in my room, and now my bedsheets smell like you. Every day discovering something brand new. Well, I'm in love with your body. 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 Every day discovering something brand new. I'm in love with the shape of you. Come on, be my baby, come on. 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 I'm in love with the shape of you. We push and pull like a magnet do. Although my heart is falling too. I'm in love with your body. Last night you were in my room. Now my bedsheets smell like you. Every day discovering something brand new. I'm in love with your body. Come on, be my baby. Come on, come on, be I'm in love with your body. Come on, be my baby. Come on, come on, be I'm in love with your body. Come on, be my baby. Come on, be I'm in love with your body. Every day discovering something brand new. I'm in love with the shape of you.
Everyone's life where nothing seems to blow your way, where nothing seems to turn out right. And then may come a time you just can't seem to find your place. For every door you open, seems like two get stamped in your face. That's when you need someone that you can call. And when all of your faith is gone, it feels like you can't go on. Let it be me. Let it be me. If it's a friend that you need, let it be me. Let it be me. Feels like you always coming up last. Your pocket's full of nothing, ain't got no cash. And no matter where you turn, you ain't got no place to stand. You reach out for something and they slap your hand. Now I remember just a little place you can call home. And that's when you need someone that you can call. When all of your faith is gone, it feels like you can't go on. Let it be me. Let it be me. Now if it's a friend that you need, let it be me. Let it be me. Let it be me. Let it be me. And if it's a friend that you need, let it be me. Let it be me. Let it be me. Birds flying high, you know how I feel. Sun in the sky, you know how I feel. Breeze drifting on by, you know how I feel. It's a new dawn. It's a new day, it's a new life for me. And I'm feeling good.
Well, we've darkened the room here, so it must be time to start. Thanks, everybody, for coming. Welcome to everybody. We're happy you're here this afternoon. Going to look at a great sunset here as we listen to this wonderful public lecture as part of our Provost Ethics Colloquium series. Now, that series was established, I don't know, about 3 years ago maybe, by our office. And it's managed by Dr. Gwen Gorzelski and the Institute for Learning and Teaching here, who leads a team of advisors that help us plan these colloquium. Now, the purpose of this ethics colloquium series are multiple. It's an acknowledgement that by our office that Colorado State has had many academic and co-curricular activities in this space, and it was ripe for enhancement. Everywhere I looked, I saw activity in ethics seminars, ethics colloquium series, curricula being developed, courses being offered, our folks going and lecturing across the country and the world as well. We also wanted to provide a central boost to these activities and enhance them modestly whenever it made sense. And I think we've taken the tack of adopting almost anything that has the word ethics in it on the on campus and saying, hey, do you want to be part of the ethics colloquium series? And usually they say yes because we buy the cookies. And we also wanted to generate a few more collaborative spaces for interaction among our faculty, students, and staff in these matters. And we wanted to bring our campus thought leaders from around the country, thought leaders from around the country to continue to stimulate us and to push us at the highest level. And finally, we wanted to make sure that we expose the Northern Colorado community and Colorado in general to our efforts here at CSU and in all of these educational and scholarly work that we're doing here. Now, I already thanked Gwen for her work on arranging Dr. Capron's visit, and there's an entire team working with her, as I mentioned. I want to especially mention Lumina Albert from Business, Moti Gorin here from Philosophy, Barb Hauser from Tilt, Kate Jiraki from our communications team, and especially Matt Hickey. Where's Matt? Here he is. He's really done yeoman's work in the last few weeks in arranging these days here with Dr. Capron. So without further ado, I'd like to bring our Vice President for Research, Dr. Alan Rudolph, to the podium, and he'll formally introduce our speaker.
Thanks, Rick, and it's really my honor to introduce Alexander Capron, and I'll do my best to distill a very distinguished career that has touched many aspects of our society and really contributed in many, many ways. And I'm sure that during his talk you'll get the full breadth of that. He's certainly a globally recognized expert in health policy and medical ethics. He teaches and has taught as part of that expertise over the course of his career. He teaches public health law, torts law, science, and medicine. And he teaches at the USC Keck School of Medicine and is co-director of the Pacific Center for Health Policy and Ethics, which is an interdisciplinary research and education center. And this is obviously an area that requires many disciplines coming together for the dialogue. He's the Scott Beast Chair in Healthcare Law, Policy, and Ethics at USC School of Law, co-director of the USC Pacific Center for Health Policy and Ethics, and professor of law and medicine at USC's Keck School of Medicine. He served for 4 years as director of ethics, trade, human rights, and health law at the World Health Organization in Geneva. He has covered a broad range of topics in ethics and medicine that have challenged us over the last decades as biotechnology and the biological sciences and medical sciences move often at a pace greater than our policy keeps up with, from stem cell research, genetics and reproductive technologies, to pharmacological research in children, organ transplant, which we'll talk about today, and equitable access to medical technologies and end-of-life care, which continues to be in our society a really important topic with regard to healthcare economics, but also just in terms of what we all are experiencing in the context of healthcare and aging. Many, many publications, and they really cross a wide swath of really important topics, books, a lot of monographs and peer-reviewed publications. His background, he received a BA from Swarthmore College, an LLB from Yale University, where he was an officer of the Yale Law Journal. He was appointed by President Bill Clinton to the National Bioethics Advisory Commission and served as president of the International Association of Bioethics. He's a trustee of the Century Foundation, an officer of the Public Responsibility in Medicine Research, an elected member of the Institute of Medicine and the National Academy of Sciences, and of the American Law Institute. It's my honor to introduce Alexander Capron.
Thank you for that introduction, and it has been a great pleasure to be here today. I had some wonderful conversations with members of the faculty, and I should say that the students that I met with can tell you that ethics comes up in classes that don't even have ethics in the title, and they recognize it and embrace it. And I was very impressed with the group that I met with. And you have a beautiful setting here, and I hope it's conducive for all of us to some reflection on the topics of transplant tourism and organ trafficking. I mentioned right at the outset the term transplant tourism may be an odd one for those who haven't heard it before, and it does not refer to going to places and collecting memories, but going to places and collecting organs. And there's usually not a lot of sightseeing involved. So let me begin with that image. And we're going to take a look at the history of this topic, which is really a history of the last 30 years. I want to begin by contrasting the mountaintop and the swamp. And this is a map which shows that in 2016, there were 135 solid organs transplanted around the world. And one of the reasons I wanted to depict this, and this is a graphic from the Global Observatory on Donation and Transplantation, which is maintained on behalf of the World Health Organization by the Spanish National Transplant Organization. Because you will see that actually transplantation takes place in every continent around the world. And not surprisingly, there are some places where it is much more prevalent and occurs at a higher rate than others. But it is a technology that has provided either a huge improvement in life for those patients who got a kidney transplant, or a life that would otherwise have ended prematurely for patients who got heart, lung, liver, pancreas transplants. And that number now, since 1954, when the first successful human-to-human transplant took place at the Brigham in Boston, that number now exceeds 4 million people. So this is a substantial achievement. And it's an achievement, as I will argue to you, not only of medicine, but of society through its laws. And I think of that as being the mountaintop. Unfortunately, there is also the swamp. Whoops, this thing suddenly decided to have a mind of its own. There. It doesn't like that slide. I don't blame it, but there it is. This is the swamp, and this is alongside the story of millions of lives saved and improved, is the story of, unfortunately, millions of lives also blighted. And the blighting has been predominantly in low and middle income countries. There have been sales of organs in other countries, but it's predominantly people from the global north going to the global south to purchase from desperately poor people looking for a way of solving problems in their own lives and their families, looking to do that through the sale of a kidney or occasionally a lobe of a liver. And the problem is so bad that in some countries, in India, for example, young surgeons who, when they're approached by senior transplant surgeons and said, "You're a talented surgeon, why don't you come and join our transplant team?" routinely say no, because they regard this as a field that is disreputable. And so the spillover isn't just to the lives of the individuals there, but to the health systems and their ability to make use of this life-saving technology and advancement. So is there any way of controlling that so it doesn't advance quite so dramatically every time I touch this? So the World Health Organization, which is the UN's specialized agency for health, it's on autopilot, began in 1987 to look at this as an issue when concerns were first expressed in the World Health Assembly about a process of organ sales taking place in poor countries. And over the next 2 years, the Assembly looked at the issue and then adopted the first resolution calling on states to take measures to prevent the purchase and sale of human organs. 2 years later, in 1991, the World Health Assembly endorsed a set of guiding principles on organ transplantation. And those had an immediate effect. Just within a year, over 50 member states adopted statutes to prohibit the sale of organs. And this was based on a notion of human dignity and human rights, which is part of the WHO history and charter. Now we're skipping again. In 2003, a dozen years after that, the Assembly decided that they should take a fresh look, and in particular look at this is the new fancy one, isn't it?
We'll try that one instead.
Okay. That they should take a new look because of a related issue of the transfer of tissues rather than just organs. And there is and we can talk about this, there is a obvious connection. Many of the tissues are harvested from donors who are also organ donors, but those tissues then go through a processing, and they become material for dental implants, and they become connective tissues and skin grafts and so forth, and they're frozen and they're distributed, and that is a commercial activity. And the countries were concerned, how do we have that explicitly commercial activity in the materials when we're still prohibiting the sale of organs? And so they asked the Secretariat to look at the issue, and in 2010 adopted a new revised set, but they didn't back off of the basic commitments, but they did address the scientific developments and extended to human cells and tissues in addition to organs. And this is a chart. I just want to sort of give you a sense of the coverage of those 11 principles. The first one is that there has to be consent for deceased donation, and that can be under national laws, whether it's a presumed consent, which many European countries have, or it requires affirmative consent, and that's guiding principle 1. Guiding principle 2 is very important. We had a session earlier today on the determination of death, and one of the requirements is that the doctor who determines death not be involved in the care of the recipient, so that there not be a direct conflict of interest. The physicians taking care of the patients, typically in an intensive care unit, have their focus on the welfare of the patient and wanting to make sure that they are absolutely certain that person is dead, and they're not looking to rushing things because they are also taking care of the recipient. Guiding principle 3 has to do with the principle of maximizing deceased donation, because there's no harm to a deceased donor, and protecting living donors. And guiding principle 4 recognizes that there will be some children or others who might be called on to be donors, basically restricts that very heavily, or an incompetent person who can never have given consent, but allows in certain circumstances where there are governmental principles in the country. I put guiding principle 5 up at the top because to me it is the core principle. And it is a principle that says there should be free donation and no purchase of human transplants as such, but costs and expenses can be recovered. Guiding 6, 7, and 8 are in service, in effect, of that. Promotion of the practice is all right, but no individual advertising. Responsibility for the transplant, the origins of transplants, that's for a concern about safety. And number 8, that justifiable fees can be charged by the surgeons and the hospitals and so forth. But it's a sign that there's actually payment under the table underway if those fees are extremely high. And then number 9 is, well, once you have the organs collected, the deceased donor organs, having a process that is transparent and equitable is essential. And finally, the new principles 10 and 11 are, it is very important that long-term outcomes be monitored so that harm can be prevented, and also accurate information provided to living donors, quality and safety of the procedures and products, and transparency of the process open to scrutiny while maintaining individual anonymity. See if I can go one forward. And this is the language of guiding principle 5, which is the only one that I'm going to show. And it is important, and yesterday when I was at the University of Colorado, there was some discussion of this issue. does not preclude reimbursing reasonable and verifiable expenses. And we now speak of this as a principle of financial neutrality, that on the one hand, people should not profit from organs, but on the other hand, donors shouldn't bear out-of-pocket costs. And there are a lot of them. And during the recession of 2008 and thereafter, in the United States, we saw a substantial drop of living-related donations because some people who were very willing to be donors did not have the wherewithal to take time off from work if they had work, to pay for screening, to travel perhaps to a distant location where the recipient was to undergo screening there, to take time during the surgery and recovery, and perhaps some time off of work later if their employer didn't cover that. And so we have a partial program that deals with that, but it has severe restrictions if either the donor or the recipient is above a certain income level. And you can understand why that would have been put in place, but it ends up meaning that there is a burden. And so the principle that prohibiting sale does not prohibit reimbursements or, of course, the costs to the system of recovery, processing, preserving the cells, tissues, and organs. Whoops. So alongside that development at WHO, the profession has also stepped up. And this is in response to that concern that I was describing as the swamp. That is to say, the physicians realizing both their obligation and really the necessity for the field of taking a responsible stand. So in 2008, a meeting was convened by the Transplantation Society and the International Society of Nephrology in Istanbul, bringing together more than 150 representatives of those medical and scientific groups, and some people from government and a few of us from ethics and social science, to develop a set of professional standards to make the profession a force for the protection of potential vendors of organs. And over the subsequent years, there really was a lot of impact. For example, this is a description of changes that began in 2008 in Israel. And the Israelis had been an example of a country that had been perfectly comfortable through their insurance system, allowing people to go to places, the Philippines were a favorite destination, and purchase an organ. And the result was that Israel, for a developed country, had a very low level of deceased donation. And there are several reasons for that, but also a low level of living donation, because people could go to other countries with their insurance funds that would pay for the transplantation, including the package that they got, which included a paid donor. And they changed their law, and they set about a process of educating people about the need to register. They also did something unusual, and again, it would be something we can talk about, which was that they recognized that one of the impediments that was very distinctive and somewhat unique was that there were groups that very conspicuously, religious groups within Israel, that were willing to be recipients of deceased donor organs, but were not, for their own religious views, willing to donate. And the effect on the general population, this was not here's an individual and there's an individual. This was a substantial block of the population. And the view that was expressed as they were trying to increase donation was, why should I give into a system where the people who might get my son's organs would not reciprocate? They wouldn't be people who would do the same if it were my son that needed an organ. And so what they did is they instituted a point system. And so in addition to all the medical reasons why one would rise up the list to get a transplant. You could get points that would give you a little boost if you were a previous donor yourself or the first-degree relative of a donor, or if you had signed up on the registry. And so the number of registrations skyrocketed. They also conducted a very conspicuous public education campaign, an advertising campaign, but they got a huge number of people signing up in that way. Had a very interesting effect with the group that had previously not wanted to donate. They didn't change their religious views. And I must say, when this was first instituted, I, in speaking to Israeli officials, expressed the view that I was uncomfortable with the notion that these people were sort of out of the club. And instead of being a community-wide thing, it was you can join the club if you get a ticket by contributing. But they came to realize that there was a chance that they could nevertheless, because of their need, get a transplanted organ, but it was unlikely. They didn't have any objection to transplantation from living donors. It was the determination of death that bothered them. And so they became very frequent living donors. So the Israeli law that was really addressing deceased donation increased living donation as a side effect, because this group, realizing they were not going to get deceased organs, started giving organs to relatives at a much higher rate. Along with that, Israel adopted a law with extraterritoriality. That is to say, they said, if you go and commit an act in another country that is now illegal here, in terms of buying an organ, we can prosecute you in Israel. And what they have principally gone after is not the people who do it, but the brokers who facilitate that. And they have made a number of convictions. And the process of Israelis going to the Philippines has precipitously fallen out. This is the other story where the Declaration of Istanbul custodian group, which is carrying on the work of the Declaration of Istanbul, has had a big impact, and that is on China. China was notorious as the place where, rather than purchasing organs from the person who got them, they arranged with judges and prison wardens to get executed prisoners. But these were not prisoners who were being taken to the electric chair or something in the prison. These were people who were called up on order when you had a patient coming in either from China or outside, and they were basically marched into the prison yard, a gun to the head, the doctor takes out the organs. And this practice, finally, it became clear to the Chinese officials that two things were true. They could not step up on the world stage in many settings. The United States Congress, for example, held hearings on that practice. And their young doctors couldn't go to international meetings and present papers because all the leading organizations in medicine said, we will not allow any papers dealing with executed prisoners, and presumptively everyone reporting about practices in China was using executed prisoners. And so they saw their desire to be players in the world of governments, intergovernmentally, and also in the scientific and medical side being barred and blocked by that. And in 2006, their Vice Minister of Health basically announced publicly that this was a practice that had gone on and they were stopping it. They've never given full details. There's never been full disclosure of the extent and the numbers. People have had various ways of estimating the number, but they then did enact laws, and there are the people who are most convinced of what they have done believe that it is now a minor practice. I'm somewhere between that and the skeptics who don't think very much has happened. So in 2018, the group adopted a revised version of the Declaration of Istanbul. And I just want to very quickly show you what happened with this. The original declaration had three definitions on organ trafficking, transplant, commercialism, and travel for transplantation, and, which is legitimate, and then transplant tourism, which isn't. 6 principles, which took up 55 lines, and 11 proposals. These were implementations of those ideas with 6 references. When we revised it this year, we now have 6 definitions. We revised the organ trafficking one, and I want to tell you about that because it's part of the title of this talk, and I want to talk about the way that happened. We added 4 new ones, and we dropped transplant commercialism because it's now incorporated within organ trafficking. There are now 11 principles, but they're much shorter. There's some commentary and 8 references. This is not a scientific paper, but we do want to show the sources for some of the things we say. Now, organ trafficking in the 2008 version was a hybrid based on the Palermo Protocol. And one of the slides that got skipped over told you what the Palermo Protocol was. It is something that is handled by the UN Organization on Crime and Drugs. It's about organized crime, and it's about human trafficking. And it defines as one form of human trafficking, in addition to labor and sex, trafficking of human beings for the removal of organs. And we tried in 2008 to manipulate that just a little, use the basic framework of it, but manipulate it to refer to human organs rather than human beings. And it was a clumsy attempt, very frankly. So the 2018 definition goes to a newly adopted convention in Europe, or the Council of Europe on organ trafficking. And it says that organ trafficking includes removing organs without valid consent or authorization, or in exchange for financial gain or comparable advantage, transporting, manipulating, and transplanting such organs, offering any undue advantage to someone to get removal or use of the organs, soliciting or recruiting donors for financial gain, or attempting, aiding, or abetting any of these acts. So the definition is a sort of a shortened version of the Council of Europe. And then trafficking, we recognize separately the Palermo Protocol as an alternative view. And the reason they're different is the act is very much the same: recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt of persons. The means is what is controversial in the organ transplant area. By the threat or use of force or other forms of coercion. Well, that has certainly happened. There have been reports of people being, in effect, kidnapped. So in those cases, that is human trafficking for the purpose of organ. But then there's the phrase, by the use of abuse of power or a position of vulnerability. And then that last phrase is, it sounds like, well, that wouldn't be right on point, giving a receipt of payment, but that's payment to a third party. So if a person has a child or a servant or someone they control, and they take the money and they offer that person, that's very much really like the first kind of thing. So some of us have argued that in many of these cases, the economic vulnerability of people, not caused by the person who wants to get the organs, but exploited by that person, comes within this area. But people who prosecute trafficking cases say it is often very difficult. I don't think it should be difficult. And then the purpose is to remove organs. The protocol is quite clear that the consent of a victim of trafficking in person is irrelevant where the means, any of the means are used. So the fact that if you can show that a person was coerced or that their vulnerability was exploited, the fact that they got money, just the way if a woman has been put into prostitution, she may get some money. But if she has been trafficked into that position, that money does not constitute her consent and wipe out the crime. So we also revised, we included a definition of resident and non-resident, and that's something that is actually very important in the developed world context. Like in the United States, people do come here to the United States for the purpose of getting a transplant, and they may bring a relative with them, and they're coming here because of the medical expertise. But sometimes people come and they happen, and then they stay and they live here, And they would qualify like a child that needs a liver transplant or something. And they would be counted as a resident, and we wanted to distinguish between residents and citizens. And the question, the non-resident is really the person who is coming for the purpose of getting a transplant. And there are concerns with whether or not that interferes with this thing called self-sufficiency, which is a concept that WHO developed after the original guiding principles. And the idea of self-sufficiency, you can say, well, if in the United States and around the world we have a huge, long waiting list, and that's true in countries even like Spain that have a very successful transplant program, how can we ever talk about self-sufficiency if self-sufficiency means meeting your own needs? And in many of these international documents, we have aspirational goals. The purpose of talking about self-sufficiency is saying to countries, don't export this problem. Don't think you're going to solve your transplant needs by sending your patients elsewhere. Be self-sufficient. But one of the things about that is if you're bringing in a high number of people from abroad, and they're getting into the deceased donor system, you're undermining self-sufficiency. And in the United States, what our transplant agency, which is called UNOS, has done, has to make a requirement of transparency. So we can look at a number of clinics, and people in positions to ask questions can say, why is your rate of foreign transplantation so much higher than everybody else's? And particularly when these are wealthy people from wealthy countries in the Gulf states and so forth. People can kind of say, is this the right thing to do, or should you be helping them to set up their own systems instead, domestically, instead of coming, since we have a scarcity and we are so far from self-sufficiency. And finally, that principle of financial neutrality, neither lose nor gain financially as a result of a donation. So very quickly, the principles are ones which by now are not going to be surprising to you, except that we began with this new language about consistent with meeting the overall healthcare needs. And this is important because I think if I were still at WHO, I would certainly be saying to governments, if we went back to that map and there were those countries that weren't doing transplantation, what are your healthcare needs? And for many of them, of course, they are fighting the double burden of infectious diseases and the diseases that arise from bad diets and so forth. They're getting Western diets brought in. They're having chronic diseases, non-communicable diseases, and then they have the underlying long history of the communicable diseases. And that's where their effort should be addressed. And a few of those diseases may end up causing organ failure, but that's not where they have to start. But where countries, in the case of kidneys, set up, often through a contract with a company from outside the country, a governmental contract to fund dialysis, then it becomes essential that they have a transplant program, or they will have an ever-lengthening list of people getting dialysis and waiting for that transplant. So, but this is to recognize, we're not saying transplantation is for everybody at this moment. It has to be consistent with their other needs. Optimal care of the organ donors, obviously, trafficking in human persons, in organs and persons should be prohibited and criminalized, and organ donation should be the financially neutral act. Obviously, the definition provided the definition of what that meant. There should be legislation and regulations to govern the recovery of the organs consistent with international standards. There should be an authority, in our case it's UNOS, to oversee and be accountable for the donation, allocation, and transplant to ensure standardization, traceability, transparency, quality, safety, fairness, and public trust. This is a program at bedrock that must have public trust. All residents should have equitable access, should be equitably allocated within countries or jurisdictions, and recognized that some people can argue occasionally that clinical criteria smuggle in some other normative values, but for the most part, clinical criteria are the most objective things we have, and it's important that they be the basis rather than ethnicity or wealth or anything else for the allocation of organs. It's complicated because sometimes issues of ethnicity affect the ability of people to get transplants because of the greater likelihood that they will have antigens to a wide range of potentially donated organs. We call in there for the very thing that is at the heart of the declaration, which is getting health professionals on the team to do the best to aid this effort against organ trafficking. Governments and health professionals implement strategies to discourage and prevent the residents from engaging in transplant tourism. One way is the way the Israelis did it. Have extraterritorial effect of your law. Just as if residents of your country are going abroad to engage in child sex trade or something, it's against the law at home. They do it, they come home, they should get prosecuted. The same is true as if they've gone and bought organs. And finally, the self-sufficiency goal. Ooh, wouldn't that be fun for you if we just skipped over all that? I don't mean to tempt you. It could all be over in just a second. I don't seem to be able to. Well, we'll go with this one. Random slides flashing on the screen. This breaks down that 135. The 2016 is the latest data. And in fact, I just got these from my colleagues at the Global Observatory a couple of days ago. And the important things here are that this is an increasing number every year. We're always falling short, though. It's only about 10% of global needs. The problem here is that global needs are ultimately very flexible. And if we overnight suddenly had 1 million transplants and wiped out that shortfall, doctors would start listing patients who today they won't list because of comorbidities, that they have other medical problems. But if we have enough organs for everyone, why not give them a chance to get one too? So there's no way we will ever cover that, but the fact that this number goes up, it's going up within countries with successful programs, and countries that haven't had programs are adding it in. So this chart, well, you won't be able to read the countries, but I wanted you to see at the top is Spain, and the yellow line is the DCD, the donation after circulatory death. And Spain does a great deal of that. They have out-of-hospital patients who collapse, attempts are made at resuscitation, and then they can become organ donors. Right below them is Croatia, and Croatia doesn't do that at all, but actually has a higher rate of brain-based determinations. And these countries, these first 4 countries, Spain, Croatia, Portugal, Belgium, and then are followed down here by a bunch of other European countries. These countries at the top of the list are basically all European countries, with the exception of the United States, which is right here. And the United States does only in-hospital determinations with circulatory death. That is to say, patients who they or their family have determined that they're on a respirator, they're not getting better, and they want the respirator withdrawn. And if they're willing to be an organ donor, this is done in the operating room. Equipment is withdrawn, the heart stops, there's asystole, there's no heartbeat, there's no respiration. They wait 5 minutes, which is much, much longer than any recorded spontaneous restoration of those functions, and then they can be declared dead, and a process of obtaining organs can occur. But it's a smaller percentage than in a number of the European countries. Down here at this end, because these are all deceased donation, down here are a number of countries where there is a good deal of transplantation, but it's not from deceased donors, it's from living donors. And those numbers would have been dramatically larger. This gives you a better, I blew up this part of it, but this gives you.
What's your scale?
We would have to go back here to look. These numbers down here are numbers of patients, numbers of donations per million population. So it's Spain is up here at 45 or something. And these countries down here are at 1% or less, one person or less per million population. Now, this shows all patients transplanted in persons per million population in 2016. And now up here at the top, again, is Spain, but right under Spain is the United States, because we have a larger number of living donors than Spain does, a larger percentage of population, as well as a larger number of donors. And so our total number is, see if I can read that. I can't read it, so. But this is our number, it's 100 per million population. And then down here is China. And they have always had a very small living donation because they were using executed prisoners. And their number now, they claim, are people registering in a normal fashion as deceased donors. Kidney transplantation is, of course, the major type of transplantation, and this allows you to see by countries the mixture of the blue line being kidney transplants from deceased donors and the red lines being transplantation from living donors. And again, the numbers are the majority of the, and this is heart transplants, which are obviously all from deceased donors. And this will give, I wanted to end by looking at the world map again. Spain, the Spanish make up these maps because they run the thing. So not surprisingly, they chose 40 or greater as a separate color from 30 to 39.9 so that Spain would stand out here on the map very differently. But basically, the dark purples are all quite comparable. And again, it's Europeans. And there's the kidney transplant activities going down to the levels of 0.01 to 4.9 transplants per million. But it does extend even into sub-Saharan Africa and, of course, South Africa. Whoops, no, you're not going to escape that easily. Where is, well, maybe you are. I want to get back to one slide that somehow got missed because I want to include where it just doesn't like certain slides. It won't go back beyond. Can we go back another slide? One more. I think it's one more. Nope. Two forward then. Whoop. It's the one with all the colors on it. I have no idea. Okay. I just want to end by discussing the arguments. It is not as though we've had a law since 1984, the National Organ Transplant Act, that prohibits the receipt or request of or payment of valuable consideration, which is just lawyer talk for anything that isn't just limited to money, but other things of value in consideration for exchanging for an organ. And not surprisingly, there are many physicians who take care of patients, particularly nephrologists with patients who are facing end-stage renal disease, who would like to increase the number and who believe very sincerely that having sales of organs would increase it. And they would look at, because I spent a lot of time talking to them, they would look at a lot of the slides that I've shown and say, well, you're describing horrors in the third world. And those are really not something that needs to concern us here. We can have a regulated market. So I'm just going to say a few words. These principles in red on the left are what is sometimes referred to as the Georgetown mantra, because Tom Beecham was on the staff of the National Commission that wrote the Belmont Report in 1978, and they set forth these three principles, and they were then elaborated by Tom and his colleague Jim Childress. And in some ways, when I'm teaching medical students, I like to get through these so that we can really get into a whole bunch of other nuanced principles. But they are well known and important for a reason. The notion of beneficence is the core principle of medicine. The notion that the patient's welfare is what you are serving above all else. The notion of autonomy is a more modern view. It was referred to as respect for persons by the National Commission, but it really meant having the ability for the patient to, at the very least, participate in the decisions and ultimately to be the decision maker. And finally, justice, something that had no particular history in medical ethics, but is certainly important in modern healthcare. And so on the pro-sale side, people say, well, beneficence, the payments received by people for their organs, can improve their lives. And, of course, beneficence, those organs, if transplanted, will save the lives of the recipients. Autonomy. Well, the donors freely decide that they will be better off with more money than with an organ. And in terms of altruism, which is often cited as the reason that people who aren't compensated give organs, that's not the only motivation. In many areas of our lives, we expect people to be motivated by a financial incentive, and we don't think that's wrong. I suspect that those of you who are actively employed show up in part every day because you love your work, and in part because it's nice to take home a paycheck at the end of the month. And finally, justice. People say, well, isn't it unfair that only the physicians and the hospitals and others are paid for this process of organ transplant, and the individual who gives the organ or the family who gives the organ of their deceased relative doesn't get any benefit financially? They get a psychic benefit, but not a financial benefit. And on the anti-sale side are the responses to that. One, if we look at what's actually paid, it is always been a relatively small amount. Some people say, well, then make it a much bigger amount, but then you worry at what point is it something, the offer you can't refuse. We also know from experience, and I don't think it's an experience that we can externalize to poor countries, that people who sell organs become stigmatized. And those pictures that I showed you, particularly of the people in the Philippines, the reports are that they become outcasts in their society because they have basically said that that scar on their shank indicates that they had no other way of living in the world but selling an organ. And if they're thinking of trying to make something of themselves or so forth, get married, no one wants anything to do with them. And that then means that even when there are medical facilities that might be offered. And this is true also in Iran. Iran is the one country that has made it legal to have paid transplant, paid donation. And even there, the donors do not seek medical care because they end up feeling that they have done something that's shameful and they are stigmatized and don't want to admit it. There are lots of reports of people not telling their own relatives, not telling their wives or whatever that they've done this. So the chance that they will be treated as patients is very different than when your relative gives an organ and then you are incredibly concerned that they always are getting the best care because they have done this, this life-saving act for you. Equally important in terms of beneficence, it is not at all clear that there would be an increase in the number of organs. Again, we can learn from abroad. Israel saw a huge increase in the number of transplants when they got rid of their system of paying for organs. And other countries where payments have existed, again, in the Arabian Peninsula and so forth, there is a very low rate, if any, of donation by people to their own relatives. Why would you ask a relative to give you a kidney if you could buy one? Yes, it's a relatively low-risk procedure and so forth, but why do you impose any risk on your loved one when you can get a kidney and walk away and not worry about that person and not have a member of your family potentially a problem? In terms of autonomy, these, yes, it is a free choice in that other than the people who are the victims of trafficking and have a gun held to their head or locked up until the organ is removed, they are choosing, they're taking money. But this is not the kind of choice that people make when they have any other alternative. If you look across countries, including again in Iran, where it's a legal practice, you don't see anybody with any substantial means going and selling a kidney. It's not something that someone does, oh, I'll just pick up some spare pocket change by doing this. It's done by people who need the money, often then discover that the money doesn't achieve what they wanted. Vendors are often ill-informed, so it's really not an informed choice. And in the end, the argument on behalf of sales that relies on autonomy becomes inconsistent with the notion of a regulated market, because a regulated market says we're not going to let certain kinds of transactions happen. But if the whole idea is you should be free to sell your organs and profit from it, if that's what you want money rather than an organ, having a regulated market will say, well, actually, we didn't actually mean that, only if certain things happen. And my own impression of regulated markets like that is the regulations are soon pushed aside because the idea of increasing the number of organs becomes more important. It is also not clear that the number will increase because sales tend to crowd out the voluntary ones. And the final issue is one of justice. Everywhere that organ sales exist, having if you look at the society, it is the wealthy, it is the privileged, it is the connected people who get the organs, and it is the poor and powerless from whom they are taken. So do we really want to live in a world where that scar on the shank becomes the sign of being a person who has no power and no money? So I will end with that. If there are other slides hiding there, you will be spared them because I can't find them. And I hope that I have provided both a history of this issue and some of the reasons why there is such an international consensus, although not yet an international achievement, not only of the prevention of organ trafficking and transplant tourism, but the encouragement of voluntary donation and the establishment of systems that would make that feasible for everyone who needs it and who wants to participate. So thank you very much.
Is this on? No. Now it's on. Good evening. My name is Moti Gorin. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Philosophy, and I'm here to moderate. So I have the microphone. If you have questions, raise your hand, and I'll walk around and provide you with the microphone so that you can be heard.
Dr. Capron.
Dr. Florent.
how much are we talking about with regard to the amount of money that a donor gets? And does that vary from country to country? And do you see people moving from one country to another to sell their organ because they can get more money in a different country than the one that they're in?
Yeah, the numbers go from very small amounts, several $1,000s, in operations where the recipient is probably paying several $100,000 for the whole package, 100 to 200,000, to more substantial amounts. So there are reports of some donors having gotten $5,000, $8,000, and so forth. And yes, in some locations in Southeast Asia, where some countries have enacted statutes and are really trying to enforce them, Singapore and so forth, there are reports of donors going to Myanmar and elsewhere where the laws are not enforced in the same way, and physicians from those countries also traveling to other countries to perform the surgeries. So yes, that certainly happens. And in terms of the recipients, that's what the whole phenomenon of transplant tourism is. There's a huge amount of travel of that sort. One of the issues there is what the relationship, and when I'm talking to a medical audience, one of the concerns they have is what can we do and still have our own patient, the potential recipient's interests at heart. And the Declaration of Istanbul Custodian Group has a set of materials in about 20 languages talking about the risks to the recipients of going abroad. I mean, the risks are not only may you get an organ from someone who has a rare disease, which will only be detected when it shows up in your immunosuppressed body, but also the risk that as these transplant locations have attempted to avoid being shut down by their own governments, they no longer give any real medical records of the type that if you went to the Anschutz campus to get a transplant there, you would come back to your local doctor with a lot of information, and obviously they would continue to have you in every so often to monitor you, but your own physician, your nephrologist or whoever would care for you with all the medical records about the transplant and all the follow-up treatment and all that plan. People return, transplant tourists return, often with no records at all. And they are usually pushed out of the country by the transplant program that doesn't want them around because they're conspicuous. I mean, here you've got a country where a person from the US is not seen a lot just in a hospital gown or something. They're out the door and back on the plane home on an early basis. So there are risks that we try to convey to the patient, and we have these pamphlets and nephrologists give them out to their patients. But let's say the patient suddenly disappears and then shows up a month or two later at the nephrologist's office with a new transplant. And we suggest that countries develop registries for all patients and on which it's recorded when they get a transplant, because they're going from being a patient with end-stage renal disease to now a transplanted patient with as much information as can possibly be gotten that the patient can give. The patient may not have a lot of information. I mean, they know they went to Sri Lanka, but they may not know a lot about the hospital and so forth. It's all done by an intermediary. But that information be in there. Then what about the issue of their need for follow-up care? Under United States regulations, the Medicare program pays for transplantation and 3 years of immunosuppressive treatments. It's crazy that it's only 3 years. It should be lifetime because it's kind of foolish to stop after 3 years. But in any case, some people have said, well, we should say to people who do that, we're not giving you that. I think my judgment is that that's too harsh. But we should, at the very least, have a method of kind of getting as much information from the person as we possibly can about how they did this so that we can go after those middlemen and they can become the link to that. The Israelis have done that very effectively. As I say, they haven't prosecuted the patients, even though what they did was illegal, but they've used evidence from the patients to go after the people who were masterminding it. And these people were often in criminal syndicates. They weren't doctors doing this. They were people who did other forms of trafficking in drugs and trafficking in weapons and so forth. And when you have a commodity like organs that are trafficked, those are the people who know how to traffic things. So I think the answer is going to be slow in coming. It's a matter of trying to work with prosecutors to say, let's have a non-punitive approach to those patients who've gone, but let's definitely try to get as much information as possible and decrease the likelihood that people will go, because the best way to decrease it is to have enough organs at home, but short of that they won't go to those countries.
As I look at this slide, I wanted to ask you about its applicability to blood donation. Blood is often considered an organ, yet we have a set of principles around blood donation that has allowed this to proceed in a very different way than you described around organ. But it strikes me that the one area in the principles, the 10 guiding or 11 guiding principles that you had at the bottom that fed into it was safety.
Yeah.
And what's interesting about the blood donation picture is that as you look at the map of the world, the blood supply in the U.S. is quite safe. Yet if you go into Africa, you can deal with 35, 40% contaminated blood with diseases like malaria. And it's interesting in that context, both individual donors may know that their blood is contaminated, yet go into the system and donate.
Yeah.
The system itself, in terms of administering that blood, also knows about the contamination of that blood. There have been pathogen inactivation methods like Mirasol that have been introduced into the world to reduce that. But I'm curious, in the dialogue that's going on about organ transplantation, how did the community deal with blood donation?
Yeah, well, the WHO dealt with it with an asterisk on the first page, which says does not apply to blood and blood products. And the other example there is, of course, eggs, sperm, and surrogates. And my sense about that is that you cannot understand on a principled basis these three different areas. You have to look at them historically. Robert Titmuss wrote a book 50, 60 years ago, when was it? About blood donation. And his argument then was that the U.S. Faced more risks as well as more difficulty having an adequate blood supply because it was a system that had commercial suppliers. The U.S. had both. You had the Red Cross blood drives and the voluntary and so forth. You got a donut maybe or something, but a glass of juice, and that was it. And then alongside that, you had the purchasers who were principally going to poor neighborhoods, Skid Row and so forth, and who had some of the same kinds of problems because they were buying from people who had that incentive. One of the arguments about organs is there are some things that can be tested for, but there are a lot of things where the reason for excluding is an information that someone volunteers. And if I'm going into a place where I know they will pay for an organ, and I talk to people and find out about what would get you not taken, I will be sure that I do not reveal anything in my medical history that would make me ineligible to be a donor. And if that is something like a previous cancer that hasn't left any outward signs, and the donor gets my organ, and is immunosuppressed, the likelihood is substantial that the donor will get cancer. And that happens all the time. It's happened any number of times. And so it's, you know, it is an issue where you need people not to have a mercenary interest in suppressing information. The egg and sperm thing is, you know, that's the history. It began with artificial insemination with donor sperm, going back to the 1950s, where endocrinologists, or mostly, I guess, really gynecologists, obstetricians, were going out to male medical students and say, would you like to make $10? And they kept the records that they kept kind of hidden in a file drawer, and because they realized that these guys didn't want little juniors showing up on the doorstep saying, you know, you've now got a nice successful medical practice, and I'm your kid, and you ought to be supporting me and the woman who got inseminated. And so it's been like that, and the same kinds of principles you would think would apply, but reproductive tissue and blood are excluded from the WHO guiding principles. And it's not for a logical reason, it's just for a historical reason. In the long run, the same kinds of concerns are there. And for the surrogate mothers, certainly a concern about exploitation and manipulation. There are places in India where they basically have dormitories full of women who are pregnant with someone else's child. Yeah.
Thank you. This was a very educational talk. I didn't realize the scope of it. But knowing that this is a complicated process, you touched on this, just what you were saying with your last answer. You know, tissue rejection, immune suppression, all the things that go along. Is there data on success from folks that have gone, you know, under the cover of darkness to these places? You know, because if you're trying to get people to say, let's stay with an organized system and not take advantage, one deterrent, even if you're really desperate, is it ain't going to work and you're going to be in worse shape afterwards. Is there evidence on how these things turn out?
I don't have overall statistical evidence. Many of the transplants are successful, but the cases where you see a transplant badly fail within a short period are basically virtually all these international transplants, and people do come back with horrendous infections, and that becomes a public health issue. I mean, they can bring back a zoonotic disease or something that will be, which no one will be prepared in Fort Collins, could never see it here or something, to deal with. And so it is a serious concern. And I know many people in the field who describe patients who tragically did that and then came back and were septic and were dead a week later. But that's in that pamphlet, that it may be dangerous for that reason. Yes? Hi.
Hi, Dr. Caprone.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm a student in the College of Veterinary and Biomedical Sciences here.
Yeah.
I thought the talk that you presented was very fascinating, but I wanted to talk, and I wanted to ask if there's any educational outreach efforts to people in developing countries, especially in cases where they might contract renal diseases if they decide to donate an extra, the second kidney that they have. Is there outreach and education to these people who might not have information?
That's on, as it were, on the positive side of trying to encourage safe donation. The various societies that were involved in establishing the Declaration of Istanbul have sister center relationships. So they will get someone from Denver to adopt a Costa Rican transplant program and go down and train them, including on the public education and what donors and recipients should learn in the process about safety. And there is, in the developing world, also a network of centers that have been very successful. There's a wonderful center in Karachi called the Sindh Institute of Urology and Transplantation, which it's a private institution. It delivers all of its care without billing the patients. So most of their patients are course, quite poor, but the quality of care is so great that they also have wealthy industrialists and so forth who go there for their treatments, and they provide the funds that allow them to do these things. And what they have a remarkable record with their donors because they actively go out and follow up with the donors who are Pakistanis who come from, not just in Karachi, but also elsewhere, when they have donated. And their rate of success in terms of the health of the donors is comparable to that in developed countries. And the people from there are now going to other centers and showing them that essential part of having a just and fair system where you take care of the donors rather than what happens in the places where they're commercial donors. These are related donors in Karachi, where they're commercial donors who never get any follow-up at all. And so it's not just developed world to these centers in the developing world, but it is also among the centers in the global south helping each other because they have the firsthand experience with how to do it in their circumstances where there are many more limited resources and so forth. So it's a great question.
Alex, what's the disparity between the theoretical maximum amount of donations that would be available from death and the need? If, let's say, everybody in the society or the country agreed to donate upon their death.
Right. Well, it's very substantial because of the circumstances in which people die. There are illnesses from which people die, which over the course of the illness makes them not suitable, not just cancer patients, but other processes. There are and it's one of the reasons why one suggestion that was made a while back about not paying the individual for an immediate transplant, but I'll pay you and you'll agree that when you die, your body will belong to me and I can get my transplant, then is that many people, even if they were going to keep that contract, might die under circumstances where they can't be donors. The law now requires hospitals to notify the local organ procurement organization when they have a patient dying in the hospital who, just patient dying in the hospital. And a very substantial number of those are immediately determined that the OPO is not going to follow up in any way because the person is not, by reason of age or illness or disease course, is not going to be a suitable donor. I don't know the exact percentage, but if you look at places like Spain, where they have presumed consent for organ donation, their numbers, as you saw, were actually very close to ours, where we have required consent. So very little of that is actually people refusing. Even where they have presumed consent, they still have the family, and they still will take a veto from the family, even though they shouldn't, because no transplant program wants to have a family that's yelling and screaming, disrupting the hospital, but also going to the press and saying, this hospital is terrible. We told them, our son was planning to register as a non-donor and something happened, he didn't get to it, or it's against our religious belief, or whatever the argument would be, and then donations would just fall off a cliff because people say, well, this is abusive. This isn't the way you treat people for something that ought to be a voluntary act. So even there, they are also far short of the numbers. Interestingly, of course, Iran is even further short. Iran was way down on that list. Even though they pay for organs, they're not at the top level. And the argument should be, well, if you pay, you can just get an infinite number because just set the price high enough and you'll have people lining up around the block. They have not only an official price, but a legally sanctioned allowance for the donor and the recipient to sit down together and make a side deal. So if I'm a potential recipient and I want to get a particular donor because she's young and healthy, I'll offer more. Or if I want it quicker so I don't have to go on to dialysis, I want my transplant next week, I'll offer more. So even with that, they do not have a rate as high as Spain that strictly prohibits and has prosecuted people who have tried to broker. There were some refugee camps in Spain, and there was a broker going into the camps and trying to recruit people to be donors, and the word got out through the human rights people working in the camps, and the fellow was successfully prosecuted. So I don't know what the number is, but we would probably not, from deceased donors, have an adequate number, but it's not unwillingness to agree on the part of the donor or the family. It's just, it isn't enough.
So I'm going to invoke the moderator's privilege, if there is such a thing, and ask a question. Steve Jobs received a liver before he died, and I think he got his liver from Indiana. Was it Indiana? He was living in California, but I think he got his liver in Indiana or Iowa. I want to say Indiana. And the way he did that was, you can put your name on multiple lists, and someone with his wealth, I think one of the requirements is that you be available within a certain number of hours. Most of us can't do that. Steve Jobs got the call, private plane. He's in Indiana. A couple hours later, he gets a liver. Someone else doesn't. Clearly, that's legal. But what's your view on that practice? Do you think that should be allowed? Because you worry then about the question of
justice. Yeah. I don't like that practice. And one of the things that the UNOS group has done is addressed, it's organ by organ. There's a separate advisory committee for each of the organs. And they have approached this slightly differently, but all of them are pushing more and more because of technological improvements on organ preservation and so forth, to move really towards a national system. But in order to keep hospitals engaged, the usual rule with kidneys is if you have a deceased donor in your hospital, one of the kidneys can go to someone who's on the national list but in your hospital area. So it would be one of your doctor's patients. And the other one would go into a pool, and then the pool, as I say, has expanded from the immediate OPO area to other OPOs and then more nationally. So the result is to try to say we should overcome the advantage that the odd wealthy person who can fly around the country can get by registering, because it doesn't seem fair, and I agree it doesn't seem fair. It strikes me as something that should only be a concern if people like you who notice it say, well, I would have nothing to do with a system like that, which was the Israeli response, as I said, of a lot of people. I don't think it is a prominent enough thing that people would think, well, I stand no chance because I can't register in 10 OPOs. Doesn't happen enough. I mean, there are relatively few people in that situation.
Maybe I can call out.
Well, you can start.
You may have answered this question already, but can you talk about the status of criminalizing selling and trafficking of organs? What percentage of the countries have actually criminalized that?
Almost all the countries have rules against it, and most of the rules, as in the United States, have criminal penalties. So they're not just things like the Declaration, which is just a statement about the right and wrong thing to do, or the WHO guiding principles. They are that next step. As far as I know, as of now, only Israel has extraterritorial jurisdiction, but there may be, I don't think South Africa has added that. South Africa had some terrible scandals of doctors in, where was it? Up in the middle of the country, who were working with an Israeli broker who was going to Brazil, getting young men from Brazil, flying them, Durban is where it was, a private hospital in Durban, and flying them there and then bringing patients from Europe and from Israel down to South Africa. So they became very aggressive in that kind of extraterritorial thing. And it was also a case that influenced the Israelis because they were embarrassed that it was an Israeli broker who was arranging all that. Yes?
Follow-on question to that. Is this federal legislation? And then
Yes.
a U.S. attorney that would prosecute?
Yes, and then the U.S. attorney did prosecute. It gets to be a little repetitious, but there was a rabbi from Israel who came to New York and was bringing over non-relatives and trying to pass them off as relatives. And several of the hospitals in the metropolitan area, both in New Jersey and in New York, prominent hospitals, in the view of some outsiders, did not do the due diligence that they should have. There's a very well-established protocol that is aiming not just at falsification, but is also aiming at making sure that the people who are doing this are truly well-informed, as you were asking about, and aware of the risks, and psychologically prepared, including prepared for what in many ways is the most tragic thing, is if the organ doesn't take and the recipient, if it's a essential organ, not replaceable by a machine like dialysis, and the recipient dies, because that causes a lot of, obviously, feelings of remorse and guilt on the part of the donor. Why, I tried to help and I didn't help, and I feel badly for the result, and am I responsible, and so forth. And so all that counseling goes on, screening and counseling for the donors, but part of it is interrogating these issues of relationship. But some of the brokers are very good at training people with the kinds of questions that they will be asked and having the answers ready so that they can pretend that they are relatives. And when we were 10 and went to our Aunt Mabel's party and some things like that, and all that kind of stuff to hide the truth.
I think we are about out of time. There are some refreshments in back, so we can continue. But let's go ahead and thank Professor Capron one more time for his visit. Thank you.
Hey, where did we go? Days when the rains came down in the hollow, playing